This is the Decarbonization Disruptors Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Cohen. This is episode 11 of our podcast, and I'm very pleased to welcome Kristin Barbato, co-founder and president of Dynamo Energy Hub. Dynamo Energy Hub connects its members from leading corporations, climate tech companies, and the investment community to shape the future of energy. Kristin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Matthew. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. I think your perspective on a lot of topics we're going to cover is going to be super unique that our audience is going to get excited about. And I wanted to learn more about you because I looked at your background, learned more about you, and having come from, I think it was Cornell and Columbia, so not terrible education. You ended up going into the utility industry, and you're our first guest to kind of come from that world. So I'm just curious kind of how you were drawn to the utility world and what motivated you to really focus career eventually in more operations and strategy for Con Edison.
Yeah, sure. Is the short question, how did you go from being utilities executive to an entrepreneur? Because that's a question I get a lot.
Sure.
Yeah, it's not exactly the direct path, but I started out in utilities because I was an engineering degree, and I went to work for Con Edison first as an intern, as a summer intern, and then I got a job with them after graduation, which was fantastic. And I think the reason I wound up going into engineering to begin with was even a little bit of a story. I initially wanted to be an architect, but I think I noticed that I wasn't as creative as I really needed to be. And I really enjoyed the same aspects of problem solving and building things. So that's kind of where I wound up getting into a lot of operational areas, working for utility. And the idea of working for a company that is so vitally essential to civilization and people's lives really appealed to me. So I went from these early days of working through at a utility, and then I actually wound up doing work with my first job out of school was actually at another utility, Florida Power and Light, and then it was later that I wound up going to coming back to New York and working in the utilities field. But the idea of going from, I had another career change while I was at Con Ed for about a decade. And I wanted to move from being just operational to be more strategic. And at the time, it was great benefit to go to business school. So I went to an executive program and shifted my training and my perspective to be more industry level, corporate finance, economics, a lot of macro things. So I went from understanding a lot of the technical and operational areas of a utility, but also then moving into how does this impact the industry as a whole, and what are trends that are happening so we can see kind of what's coming down the pike. So those were early days of utilities. But then as you mentioned, now I'm in this completely different role and moving from giant companies. I actually worked for the city of New York. I was the chief energy management officer under Mayor Bloomberg's term. And so we had a huge operation there. So I've always been very operationally focused when it comes to energy related projects, especially in urban areas. And I think the curiosity that I had in moving to different roles within the industry really gave me a well-rounded perspective on what the different roles were in the industry itself, and why collaboration is so important, and how working together to see the other person's perspective and understanding how you're getting some of these really big problems tackled is so important. So that's a little bit about how I started out, and then and then now I'm doing very similar work with a really another different kind of company.
And I'd love to hear your perspective because you're our first guest that really the bulk of their career has come from the utility space. We work with a lot of clean tech startups and companies that, are always talking about this is how we benefit the utility. This is how we work with them. From your perspective, from whether it's clean tech companies, whether it's program management, whether it's, large, OEMs that are creating HVAC and building automation solutions, what does the utility need from them to reach the type of sustainability and decarbonization goals that they all have right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm really glad to be able to have some experience to lend some thought to that, because you're right. There's a lot that the critical infrastructure of utility needs to adapt to as we're changing in this energy transition timeframe. And so when you're working with startups or big corporations that all have innovative solutions that are trying to get them either into their own buildings, their own customers, their own companies and operations, how does that relate to the grid? And this is something that is, although I haven't worked for a utility in several years, I've worked for several utilities and still work with them. So I can say that the needs of the utility, the challenges of the utility at a high level still remain the same. It's reliable service, cost effective, and making sure that they are addressing the regulatory needs, which represent what the customers need. So with that, those are some of the major tenets of what utilities are thinking. But how to be reliable, how to be cost effective, and what our customers' needs and regulatory environment has evolved over the last couple of decades. We've seen a lot more need for plug load and what that means to grid modernization. And so as demand for electricity goes up, then how are we modernizing the grid to make sure that we're addressing those needs? And then when you think about, of course, renewables and integration of intermittent resources, then how does that relate to a grid that was designed for very steady types of electron flow from a single plant, not these multinodal types of resources that happen with huge plants that could be giant wind farms offshore, or they could be customer sited at your house for solar panels. So integrating those types of renewables is a big change for the grid. And so utilities are constantly thinking about that, because the grid was originally designed, and I use this joke all the time, that if Thomas Edison came back from the dead, he could probably still fix what's going on in the utility industry, or if there was a problem in the network. But all jokes aside, what that really means is that the infrastructure that we have was designed with a kind of, I guess, unidirectional electron flow, big plant, big transmission lines, distribution lines, and then stops at the meter. But what's happened over the years now is that the industry has really shifted because of environmental concerns, growing customer choice, and digitalization, newer types of resources. So there's so much more that the grid needs to contend with, including multi-directional electron flow, meaning that's, where years ago, electrons flowing back from a house meant that there was a short and there was a problem. Now it means that they're probably feeding back into the grid. So those are some other areas. And then, of course, customer expectations continue to change and evolve because customers are understanding a lot more about their energy usage. They're much more cognizant of where their resources are coming from. So they may have electric vehicles that they're charging. And so now their demand charges are completely different for them to consider, but also how the utility can serve that. So there's just so many things that I think are critical to understand and just have a perspective about for what the utilities are trying to do to enable energy transition solutions.
And given that perspective, I'm sure that's a big help when you transition your career from the utility space into Dynamo. And I'd love to hear more about kind of how Dynamo Energy Hub came to be, and then obviously what made your decision to help companies in the clean energy transition.
Yeah, it's a great story. I love telling how I co-founded Dynamo Energy Hub with my amazing co-founder and partner and our CEO, Mead Harris. We had known each other for years. We'd worked together. I was part of an organization that she had started earlier. And she approached me one day when we were in San Francisco for a conference and said, you know what, I have this idea and I think you can help me build it. Well, at the time, I had literally just started my own little consulting shop It's called Build Edison still. And the purpose of Build Edison is to help technologies get to the next level of commercialization. So whether you're a small startup and looking to grow your company, or you're an institution, a large company, a corporation or an institution trying to figure out how to develop energy innovation programs and moving the needle on getting more technologies into the infrastructure operations, that's where we help out. So anyway, that's an aside.
No.
Back to Dynamo. What you got there was a little picture of in my head when Mead was approaching me about this idea, and I was like,
Right.
I just started this other thing. So she's like, no, she's amazing. I've known her for years, and she said, I think what we can do is let's think about this for a while and see how we can do this, because the whole premise of Dynamo, the problem she wanted to solve, was bringing people together from the different stakeholder groups that are still very fragmented in this industry to collaborate to accelerate what it is they're trying to do. So how do we build this community, this membership, this network of energy transition leaders that come from many different standpoints? So it could be utilities or other large corporations like giant tech, like Google, or it could be government and how they have different policies that they're trying to understand or enact, as well as understanding different programs that exist. Then another stakeholder group that we have is the investor community. And the investors that we have as part of Dynamo range from the very early stage seed investors to others that are ginormous infrastructure investors, and how they're thinking about either equity or project investment. They're in the mix with trying to move the needle on this energy transition as well. And then, of course, it's startups, the innovators, the people who are trying to put forth something that they have been working on for years and years into the market. So how do we bring them together? And that's really at the core of what Dynamo Energy Hub is.
It's great. I'd love to hear, if you can, like a success story or kind of examples of, especially a startup that came into your community and used that collaboration to grow, and and what part of the collaboration and what areas that they use to really help accelerate a product or service.
Yeah, there's actually several. So I'll kind of categorize them into the different types of success stories, as we've called them. We have had several startup companies gain an investor, either a lead investor or a follow-on investor. We've had them gain advisory board members. They have actually collaborated to get deals done for new sales. They've gotten exposure to have speaking opportunities at different events that we hold that enable them to to amplify their voices and interact with people that they may not have been able to get in the room with. So from a startup perspective, we've had a lot of success stories along that way. And then also you could say the same thing for the investors and the corporates that join our membership, because they also get an opportunity to see who are the new startups, what are they working on, how can they actually fit into what we're doing, either from operationally or as an investment strategy. So we've had one of our corporates she listed, I think it was 5 deals that she got done within a year's time frame because of the Dynamo network and the introductions and the relationships. It's not just an introduction. It's actually the ability to build a relationship and hear what's happening and get to know others across these different stakeholder groups. So yeah, we even had this really odd one recently this summer where we held an event, which was terrific, up in Martha's Vineyard. And it was a lot of executives looking at what's going on in this energy transition with respect to each of their areas. And one of them was talking with another and was like, oh, I have this idea. I think you'd be really great. I should get you an introduction to this group. But next thing you know, they're at the White House.
Wow.
So it's like, okay, that's good. That's a good one. Yeah, nice success story there. So anyway, very different types of successes that range from getting a deal done, getting an advisor, a new investor, a new project, a speaking opportunity, or even your next hire.
Wow. It's really, I mean, I think the success stories that you're talking about, I think are really impactful. What I'm curious about from your perspective is you've been around a lot of clean tech startups in your career, obviously in your current role. What is the common denominator that makes a clean tech startup really stand out, especially in the current environment where, there's forced funding, there's an opportunity, but maybe not as much as a couple of years ago. What do they have to do to their product, to their messaging, to really be able to have an accelerated growth out of the gate?
Yeah, that's a great, great question. Get those kinds of questions all the time. I would say there's a few things that are real that make startups great. And I can go for this is in no particular order, but one is understanding your market and how you relate to it. So what that means is understand there's all kinds of things that go underneath that. It's customer discovery, it's understand market development, and you usually have to do that with others. So you can understand where your product or services fits best, and then how you are taking a technology and actually making it a solution. So enabling that takes a lot of understanding. It takes a lot of conversations, but it also takes building a great team. I'd say the most successful startups are the ones that have grown because they understand what it is they're doing. They can articulate how their solution actually is beneficial, and they have a team behind them that is on board with the life of startup, which is not easy. The team isn't just the hires that you have. It's the founders. It's the core of what it is you're trying to do, but it's also who is advising you, who are your investors, and how are you working with them in those relationships to enable you to have those candid conversations when maybe something didn't go according to plan. Can you leverage those relationships of advisory board, investors, and other types of mentors, and even in your own team, to strategize about how to move forward and actually make it not just something that could have been tripping you up, but something that you learned from and enabled further success and lessons to go on. So there's a lot there. I think another area that I would say is understanding sales. A lot of times startups are some great technology where the founder was in a lab for a decade trying to figure out how to make this thing work. And then they start to build a business out of that. And then there's a very, very different type of premise. So moving from lab to the business world takes all of those resources, including an understanding of how you make your sales. So those are just some things that I've observed. I think the best startups are those that are really good at getting their message across.
Yeah, and I was curious about that because a lot of the guests that we've had have talked about, you mentioned how something can go from a product to a solution. And what I hear more and more is it's all about how practicality is key, right? And so being able to integrate it into the market, especially from your perspective, coming from a utility, do you see that? Do you see practicality being more on the forefront? Because there's a lot of disruptive technologies that can't be just thrown into our electrical system, right? I mean,
That's right.
they will have to do. So is that what you're seeing?
Yes. I think that the disruptors, especially in this industry, they need to have an element of practicality and fundamental reach. So it's not going to be disruptive if it can't be useful. And if it's not useful and practical, people aren't going to adopt it. So I'm curious if some of the others that you've spoken to were startups that had a software technology or some sort of hard tech, which is slightly different because of how you are approaching your market. This goes into a bit of that accessibility, not necessarily practicality, but the accessibility of how accessible is your solution to your target customer.
No, it makes perfect sense. I'd be curious, given what you've been doing the last couple of years, what technologies or services do you see on the horizon in the clean tech world, or maybe even ones that you wish got more visibility that people aren't adopting that they should?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When my background, just stepping back for a moment to answer this, my background has been in grid infrastructure and a lot of built environment solutions and some renewables that, of course, because that's part of all of that. But I'd say we've evolved in the built environment. Like, what are we doing in the buildings of today? From the low hanging fruit of simple efficiency, like changing out lights, changing more efficient light bulbs, more efficient equipment, that kind of thing. That's something that I think a lot of people have already adopted. So what is the next level of built environment technology solutions? I truly think it is the integration in this of the building's operations from an energy consumption standpoint to the grid. So how does the building actually operate within the time frame of what their demand charges are? How are they actually using energy in the building at different times? Can it be conserved? Do they have systems that really can help them optimize how they're using energy in the building with respect to timing of prices on the grid?
Yeah, so what you talked about earlier, right? That kind of cross integration where you can't have electrons going one way, right? If you get it to go two ways, then everyone can be a stakeholder in the electrical use, as opposed to we're gonna give this electricity to you and hope for the best, as opposed to we have to do it together. Great.
You'll take these electrons and you'll like them.
Right.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
There's a lot more choice and a lot more flexibility, but that also brings about a lot more complexity. So I also, just a few more things that we're seeing on the horizon. I mean, at our Dynamo events that we have, we're constantly looking at what are the next trends that are happening within the industry. And I'm hearing more and more, not just about renewables, but hydrogen is taking a big step forward. I think this has been a solution or a technology that has been very big in Europe, but is now starting to cross over to the U.S. and you're seeing a lot of dollars invested in hydrogen solutions. I also am really curious about how storage technologies are going to evolve. When you think about the intermittent nature of renewable technologies as resources, they're fantastic. However, you need to have something that can buffer that. And right now, one of the major issues in the industry is electrons are not easily inventoried. They're not stored well. So how do we have storage at different levels for different types of user applications? And what is safety has always been a concern with storage solutions. How does this relate to EV technologies? Is the car that you use also a battery? So there's a lot, I think, that's going to happen with the interplay of renewable and intermittent energy resources with storage technologies. And that, of course, is going to necessarily require an optimization of those resources and how we use them. So I still am thinking that in the energy transition stage that we're in today, there is a critical need for a portfolio of different types of resources and assets, and how we use them is going to be a product of what that end user needs for their operations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, everyone I talk to is always talking about there's not one solution. You have to do it all. And my hope is
you don't have to be everything to everybody, though.
Right.
That I think is almost daunting, right? Like you have to do it all. Like we all. I think you do have to have an eye for what works best for your operations, though.
It makes sense, and I think your perspective and the work you're doing to really help that collaboration and get those technologies out to market is great. And I think we're excited to see kind of what goes forward. Which is why, in closing, I wanted to ask, if you want to share anything about what's going on now, Dynamo, what's upcoming, how do people get involved?
Yeah.
Love to hear, that your thoughts on that our audience should know and get excited about.
Wonderful. I'd love to actually talk about that because we have some very exciting things coming up. We have our annual Climate Week Energy Transition Summit coming up in New York City. So that is our biggest event of the year. We have a couple hundred people actually for a half day of really insightful conversations with companies like NRG, Ørsted, Google, Toka, a ton of different startups that we're actually going to be spotlighting in innovation spotlights. And then we have some C-suite executives and the DOE coming. So we've got a lot of, for the energy transition, we've got some really great heavy hitters that will be doing fireside chats, panel discussions, keynote conversations. And of course, the best part is all the networking. So that's one. And then we have our Climate Tech and Tonic series that we do with Bloomberg NEF. That'll be coming up in London. And we have another of those coming up every year in San Francisco and New York. And then just in general, we have events, hubs, members, networking, all kinds of other perks and services. So you can, in 13 different cities around the world. So we're mostly in the US. And as a member perk, you can work from any one of our hubs. And we've got a fantastic growing membership. So if you're interested in learning more about Dynamo, our membership perks, our events, our ability to help work with others to get them to their next level of what they're trying to do in the energy transition, you can find us in a few ways. Our website is dynamoenergyhub.com, DYNAMO, Energy Hub. We're also on LinkedIn, which you can see, all kinds of announcements about our events and spotlights of our members as well.
Great. And we'll make sure to put both links in the description of the video below. So you'll be able to get to Kristin and Dynamo, and you'll be excited to see what comes up. So again, Kristin, thank you for taking the time to do this. Really insightful conversation. And we hope to, be connected with you for the foreseeable future. So again, thank you for taking the time. This is the Decarbonization Disruptors Podcast, and we will see you next time.